The 20th of January 1943, high above Western Europe, dawn crept slowly over a frozen patchwork of fields and rivers, the pale winter sun struggling to burn through a ceiling of cloud. At 25,000 feet, the air was thin and merciless. Frost clung to metal. Engines droned with a steady, mechanical persistence that felt almost alive. Inside a single-seat American fighter, oxygen hissed softly. The only sound that cut through the vibration of the airframe, the aircraft was alone. Below, Germany stirred awake under blackout rules and flak batteries. Above, contrails formed and vanished like chalk marks erased by wind. Somewhere beyond the cloud layer, a formation of German attack. Aircraft was assembling, dozens of them tasked, with intercepting Allied bombers moving steadily toward the PA, Reich's industrial heartland. The fighter climbing toward them was not supposed to be here alone, and it was not supposed to work. Among Allied pilots, it had earned an unkind reputation. Too heavy, too slow, too vulnerable when caught without escort. In mess halls and briefing rooms, it had been mocked as a suicidal machine, an aircraft that could not dogfight its way out of trouble, that relied too much on brute force and not enough on elegance. German pilots believed this with confidence. The Luftwaffe, by 1943, still trusted deeply in its traditions. Speed, maneuverability, precision. These were the virtues that had shattered Poland, France, and much of the Soviet Air Force in earlier years. German fighter doctrine emphasized control of the engagement, dictating when and how combat occurred. Anything that could not turn tightly, climb rapidly, or disengage cleanly was considered inferior. The American fighter approaching them violated nearly every expectation of air combat that German pilots held. That was precisely why it mattered that by the third year of the war, the air over Europe had become a proving ground not just for machines, but for ideas. The United States had entered the conflict with enormous industrial capacity, but limited combat experience against seasoned opponents. Early encounters revealed painful gaps, aircraft lost, crews shot down. Tactics questioned. The solution was not immediate brilliance. It was iteration. American designers and commanders approached the air war with a different philosophy. They accepted imperfection. They adjusted in real time. And they leaned heavily on one advantage their enemies could not match: abundance. Fuel, engines, airframes, ammunition, these were not rationed ideas. They were tools meant to be used aggressively, even wastefully if necessary. The fighter climbing alone that morning embodied this philosophy. It was built around an engine so large it seemed excessive, a radial powerhouse that drank fuel and shook the airframe under full throttle. It carried more ammunition than many fighters carried in total armament. Its armor plating added weight that pilots could feel in every turn. To traditionalists, it looked like a bomber masquerading as a fighter. German intelligence reports reflected this assessment. They described the aircraft as inelegant, overbuilt, and unsuited to close combat. Luftwaffe pilots were instructed to exploit its perceived weaknesses, draw it into turning engagements, attack from above, overwhelm it with numbers. The expectation was clear. A lone example of this American fighter, encountering a formation of German attackers, should be eliminated quickly. What happened instead unsettled that belief. Historical records indicate that on that winter morning, a single American pilot intercepted a large group of German aircraft attackers and their escorts moving to strike Allied bombers. The exact number varies by source. German post-war accounts suggest between 25 and 30 aircraft were involved. American after-action reports were more conservative, noting a significantly superior enemy force. What is not disputed is that the American fighter engaged them alone. The symbol that would come to define this encounter was not a maneuver or a kill tally. It was sound, the deep, sustained roar of the engine at full power. Unlike lighter fighters that relied on finesse, this aircraft was designed to absorb punishment and keep moving. Its engine could run with cylinders shot out. Its airframe could return riddled with holes. American pilots joked grimly, that it would bring you home even if you forgot half of it over Germany. That confidence was not bravado. It was mechanical reality. As the German formation came into view, pilots expected a brief interruption, a single American aircraft making a token attack before breaking away. Instead, they saw something unfamiliar. The fighter did not dive away. It climbed directly toward them, engine screaming, closing distance with deliberate intent. German accounts described confusion in the initial seconds. This was not how such an aircraft was supposed to behave. The American pilot fired early and often, not with the precision of a sniper, but with the relentless pressure of volume. Streams of .50 caliber rounds reached outward, tearing through airspace and forcing immediate reactions. German pilots broke formation instinctively, their planned attack unraveling under unexpected aggression. This was not a duel. It was disruption. The American fighter did not attempt to outrun its opponents. It did not linger in vulnerable positions. It used speed in a straight line, diving and climbing through the formation, attacking, separating, and re-engaging before cohesion could be restored. The engine never backed off. German pilots later noted the psychological impact. One described the aircraft as refusing to retreat. Another remarked on the volume of fire, writing that it felt as though one plane carried the armament of many. This perception mattered more than numbers destroyed. According to Allied bomber crew reports, the German attack that morning never fully materialized. The formation scattered. Some aircraft disengaged entirely. Others turned back early, abandoning their approach. Bombers that should have faced concentrated interception instead encountered fragmented resistance. One pilot had not destroyed an enemy force. He had stopped it. The transformation lay not only in outcome, but in understanding. German pilots began to reassess what they had encountered. The American fighter they had dismissed as crude revealed a different strength, not elegance, but endurance. Not agility, but insistence. American commanders took note as well. The engagement reinforced a growing realization. Survivability and firepower could compensate for tactical disadvantages. That an aircraft designed to stay in the fight could dominate airspace not by perfection, but by persistence. The recurring symbol of this story, the engine's roar, came to represent something larger. It was the sound of industrial democracy at war. Not subtle, not restrained, but dependable, overwhelming, and willing to press forward. It was abundance translated into motion. The pilot returned to base with damage visible across the airframe. Mechanics counted holes, shook their heads, and prepared the aircraft for another mission. There was no ceremony, no dramatic announcement. Just repair, refuel, reload. In the German command structure, the response was quieter and more troubled. Tactical briefings began to include warnings about the aircraft previously mocked. Pilots were advised to avoid prolonged engagement, to attack in coordinated numbers, to respect its firepower. The expectation had shifted. What had been dismissed as suicidal was now considered dangerous, and that change, small, incremental, almost invisible, marked the beginning of a larger transformation in the air war over Europe. The days that followed that winter interception did not immediately rewrite history, but they left faint marks, annotations in after-action reports, marginal notes in German intelligence summaries, quiet acknowledgments among American squadron commanders that something unexpected had occurred. Air wars rarely turn on single moments. They turn on accumulation, on repeated encounters that slowly force one side to adjust its assumptions. By early 1943, the Luftwaffe still believed it understood the rhythm of Allied fighter behavior. British aircraft tended toward coordinated formations and methodical interceptions. American fighters, newer to the European theater, were still learning how to protect bombers deep into enemy territory. The Germans expected escort fighters to stay close to bombers, to act defensively, to avoid isolation at all. What they did not expect was a single aircraft, deliberately stepping outside that logic. Operational records from the 8th Air Force show that Lone fighter interceptions were not encouraged. Doctrine favored mutual support, overlapping fields of fire, and clear lines of withdrawal. Yet the realities of combat weather, timing, mechanical failures, frequently produced moments when pilots had to choose between disengagement and initiative. The American pilot's decision that morning reflected a broader cultural difference in command philosophy. WWII doctrine allowed for individual discretion in ways the Luftwaffe increasingly struggled to match. By 1943, German pilots operated within tighter tactical frameworks, constrained by fuel shortages, limited replacement aircraft, and an organizational culture that emphasized strict adherence to plan. This contrast became visible in the skies. German pilots expected predictability. What they encountered instead was disruption. In the weeks after the incident, similar engagements began to appear in combat logs. American fighters, particularly those previously criticized for weight and handling, were increasingly used in aggressive forward roles, not to chase enemy fighters endlessly, but to break their timing, to force reaction instead of allowing preparation. The engine sound returned again and again in German pilot accounts, not described with technical precision, but with unease. A constant grinding presence that did not fade when expected. It followed dives. It followed climbs. It followed damaged aircraft limping westward. Sound carries differently in combat. It lingers in memory longer than silhouettes or tracers. The roar of a large radial engine at full throttle was not elegant, but it was unmistakable. It became associated with interruption, with plans, collapsing mid-execution. American maintenance records from this period underscore how central abundance was to this evolving tactic. Engines were replaced on schedules that would have been unthinkable for German units. Ammunition loads were maximized. Armor plating remained non-negotiable despite performance costs. Losses were analyzed not to minimize expenditure, but to refine survivability. German logistics told a different story. By 1943, fuel rationing limited training hours. Replacement pilots arrived with fewer flight hours than their predecessors. Aircraft repairs grew increasingly improvised. The Luftwaffe still fielded skilled aviators, but the margin for error was shrinking. Against this backdrop, the suicidal American fighter revealed its true nature. It was not designed to win gracefully. It was designed to stay present. This presence altered German expectations. Where once a lone Allied fighter was dismissed as a minor threat, it now demanded attention. Fighters peeled away to engage it. Attack formations hesitated. Escorts tightened their spacing, reducing flexibility. Each of these adjustments carried costs. The American pilot's earlier engagement was studied quietly. His gun camera footage, grainy, imperfect, showed repeated passes through enemy formations, firing bursts long enough to force breaks, but short enough to conserve ammunition. Analysts noted how rarely the aircraft attempted to turn tightly. Instead, it relied on momentum and mass, converting altitude into speed and speed into pressure. The transformation was doctrinal as much as tactical. American commanders began to articulate a philosophy that had been implicit all along. Air superiority did not require technical superiority in every category. It required the ability to impose one's presence repeatedly, sustainably, and at scale. The fighter's engine roar became emblematic of this idea. Not a single dramatic crescendo, but a continuous note that refused to fade. German pilots, by contrast, experienced growing cognitive dissonance. They had trained to dominate airspace through mastery and finesse. Now they faced an opponent who accepted inefficiency, even embraced it, so long as it produced pressure. This clashed deeply with Luftwaffe tradition. Post-war interviews capture fragments of this shift. One German pilot later remarked that American fighters seemed less concerned with elegance than with endurance. Another noted that engagements felt less like duels and more like collisions of will, the American pilot at the center of the earlier Interception did not become a household name. His actions were folded into statistics, into broader trends. That anonymity itself reflected the system he represented. Individual heroism mattered, but it was the repeatability of such actions that reshaped the air war. Each mission returned aircraft scarred but functional. Each landing reinforced confidence in design choices once mocked. Each successful disruption of German attacks protected bombers, preserved crews, and eroded enemy morale incrementally. The sound of the engine followed these missions home. It echoed across airfields as fighters returned, mechanics already moving to prepare them for the next sortie. There was no pause long enough for myth-making. Only continuation, and that continuation, steady and unglamorous, began to tilt the balance by the spring of 1943. The air war over Europe had entered a phase defined less by spectacle and more by attrition of belief. The Luftwaffe still possessed skilled pilots and formidable machines, but certainty, the quiet confidence that had once guided every interception, was eroding. Encounters with American fighters that refused to behave as expected accumulated like hairline fractures in doctrine. German planners attempted adaptation. Interception altitudes were adjusted. Escort tactics were revised. Pilots were instructed to engage from optimal angles and disengage rapidly rather than commit to prolonged encounters. On paper, these changes appeared rational. In practice, they revealed a deeper problem. The initiative was no longer exclusively German. The American fighter, once dismissed as suicidal, had become an unpredictable, variable. Mission reports from the 8th Air Force show increasing use of aggressive forward patrols. Fighters were sent ahead of bomber streams, not merely to shield but to provoke. The objective was disruption rather than annihilation, forcing German formations to react early, to burn fuel, to scatter before reaching optimal attack positions. The engine's roar accompanied these tactics like a signature. Pilots learned to trust it. They pushed throttles forward and let the aircraft do what it was built to do: absorb stress and keep moving. German pilots encountered this presence repeatedly. The psychological effect compounded. A single fighter could no longer be ignored. Engaging it demanded attention, coordination, and time resources increasingly scarce. Every second spent dealing with an unyielding American aircraft was a second not spent organizing a concentrated assault on bombers. The expectations that once guided Luftwaffe engagements began to fail at the moment of contact. Instead of quick eliminations, pilots found themselves drawn into messy, fuel-draining encounters. Instead of clean breaks, they faced repeated reappearances. The American fighter would dive away, only to climb back into the fight moments later, engine never wavering. Combat data supports this shift. Bomber loss rates during certain missions decreased not because German fighters were absent, but because their attacks were fragmented. Gun camera analysis showed fewer coordinated firing passes and more isolated, hurried engagements. Transformation often arrives quietly in war. It does not announce itself with a single decisive battle. It manifests as hesitation where confidence once lived. German after-action summaries from mid-1943 began to include language that hinted at frustration. References to unexpected resistance, persistent enemy fighters, and difficulty maintaining formation integrity appear with increasing frequency. These were not admissions of defeat, but they were acknowledgments of change. For American pilots, the transformation was internal as well. Aircraft once regarded with skepticism earned trust. Crews who had doubted their ability to survive deep penetration missions found reassurance in returning machines battered but intact. Confidence shifted from individual skill to system reliability. The engine sound steady, consuming unavoidable became a reassurance. It symbolized not speed or elegance, but continuity. It meant the aircraft would not abandon its pilot at the first sign of damage. It meant there would be another pass, another chance to disrupt, another opportunity to survive. This symbolism extended beyond the cockpit. On the ground, it echoed through maintenance depots and factories. Thousands of identical engines rolled. off assembly lines, each one a promise of replacement, of persistence. Where German industry struggled to keep pace under bombing and material shortages, American production expanded relentlessly. The Luftwaffe faced not just machines, but a philosophy. An opponent willing to trade refinement for resilience. Willing to accept damage so long as the mission continued. Willing to keep returning by late 1943. German pilots no longer laughed at the American fighter's reputation. They respected it warily. Some avoided it when possible. Others engaged only with numerical advantage. But even then, the encounter carried uncertainty. The solitary American fighter had become more than a tactical problem. It was a reminder that air superiority was shifting away from artistry toward endurance. The engine's roar followed German pilots back to base, lingering in memory long after the noise faded. It represented an enemy that could not be easily discouraged, whose presence was not dependent on perfect conditions or flawless execution. And in that realization lay the deeper transformation, the recognition that the war in the air was no longer about who flew better, but about who could keep flying longer.